On behalf of Charlotte Jackson Fine Art, welcome to A Dialogue with Ed Moses and Ronnie Singh. Ed Moses is a member of the generation of California-based abstract artists. His career has spanned over 50 years, since his first exhibition in 1957 at the legendary Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles. Ed is one of the most forceful and consistently challenging modernist artists of his generation, often defying description. He has repeatedly embraced new approaches to his art, which range from his early, delicate, abstract drawings to the architectural grid work and resin paintings of the 1970s, to the current work experimenting with paint and his secret sauce that he's producing now. Ronnie Singh is Senior Research Associate at J. Paul Getty Museum, Contemporary Programs and Research. Ms. Singh was co-curator of the highly popular Pacific Standard Time exhibition at the Getty Museum in 2012 that focused on post-war art in Los Angeles, featuring over 70 works from more than 40 artists, including Ed Moses and many others. Please welcome Ed Moses and Ronnie Singh.
Some years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I got very interested in Van Doesburg. He was a contemporary of Mondrian around the turn of the century, and he did bigger and bolder paintings with big separation marks in between the cells of primary color, and he did them on walls as well as paintings. And a friend of mine gave me the book, and I said, God, those are really beautiful. I would like to start with him and see where it takes me. So I did them, but they were beautiful, but they looked like Van Doesburg. In the process of my curiosity, I was looking at some early reproductions and a Mondrian actual painting. And when oil paint gets old, and they were little cells, as you know, Mondrian makes these divisions. It had a lot to do with contemporary architecture and his way of dividing up the plane. And in those little cells of primary colors, the paint had all crackled. Because oil paint, when it gets old, and the paintings, most of them are not any bigger than that, little fissures in there. And I said, wow, that's great. How can I expand that? How can I extend these Van Doesburgs? So I did some research. And when my kids were little, we used to go to the Jack in the Box all the time. They loved Jack in the Box. And they had secret sauce. And they lathered that in with whatever you were eating, hamburgers and I said, God, that's great. I've got to find some secret sauce. So I went to Jack in the Box and asked them if they could make big tubs of secret sauce for me. And I thought, now I'm going to paint these canvases, but how am I going to get them to crackle? Secret sauce. So I took these big spatulas that people cook with and lathered these paintings all over the primary color, which would be white in that case, sort of a yellow gold in that, et cetera, around the room. And then I lathered the secret sauce all over it. And then when that had dried and became very taut for reasons that are inexplicable, I then took a paint roller and rolled the secondary color, which would be, in that painting there, black. And when it hit the secret sauce in the bright heat of the sun, they don't always work. They would start crackling like that. And I remember this woman visited my studio and she said, it's just amazing. How do you do all those little lines. I said, lots of patience, madam. And I remember another time when I used to have these shiny little flickers there. And late one night, my bathroom overlooks this big, I paint outside, by the way. I have fairly nice studios, but they're viewing places. So I paint all day, and at the end of the day, I drag them in kicking and screaming into my studio and tilt them around. And I either get a winner and a lot of losers. So they go back outside, they're painted out again, and I do it over and over and over again. And every once in a while, I get one that has magic. Where does this magic come from? Where does the concept of magic come from? Let's look at the social anthropologists. When they talk about early man, and he first saw his footprint in mud, a blood stain on the wall, boom, bam, I exist. Up to that time, he was part of the phenomenal world. And at that point, he was separated, like Adam and Eve. Once they became self-conscious, we've been chasing that rabbit down a hole all of our life, trying to get back to the phenomenal world. The Buddhists have the most intelligent approach to that. There's a few Buddhists in this room, and they might even agree to that. So I've been a student of Buddhism for a long time, trying to get back to the phenomenal world. In other words, not being self-conscious, me, you. Aggression has been my big, what would you call it? It's over my head, it shrouds my head. And I had a teacher once, a Buddhist teacher, that said, Ed, have you ever thought of responding to things that piss you off, or reacting? Well, I've always reacted. I remember recently this woman who I could never stand. And she was a great architect's sister. And she came up to me this opening. She always is, on your face. And I just reached down and I bit the shit out of her right on the cheek. Well, it cost me a couple of paintings, a lot of money. That's when this guy told me, he said, have you ever thought of responding rather than reacting? Sometimes someone's driving down the street and he ace you out. I used to jump right out and duke it out. I got my ass kicked many times, tell me. So anyway, at this point in my life, I'm a responder. So no matter what we say to each other, I will merely respond. Getting back to where are we, how we did these paintings?
Well, I mean,
yes, go ahead.
In these paintings, there's a moment of chance where it all comes together, but then there's a real control that you've developed. And you've really, from some of these that look almost like your quintessential rose drawings early on to, some of these that look more almost like, tree trunks. So what is that balance between chance and control, and how you've developed these?
Well, I've never wanted to be in control. I want to be in tune. So the idea is you work with these materials and you connect up with them for reasons that are, again, inexplicable. So I discovered, this one sort of announces that somewhat. I fell on one day after the secret sauce and the last color, just as the secret sauce was drying and it gets a crust on it, that I fell on it and it made a little punch with my elbow and it made a circle. See how those spin in circles like that? And I say, so that would be the closest thing that would indicate control, but as again, I prefer in tune. I want to be in tune with the phenomenal world. And here I am.
And you were saying that many of them, I mean, for every one that we see hanging up on the gallery wall, that there's many that just don't cut it. So
yeah,
how do you, how can you tell when you really hit a home run?
People often say that. The artist really doesn't say. People often say the artist is not a good judge of what he does. And I say, well, if he's not, we're in deep trouble. So.
Because you're the ultimate judge.
That's right. And what happens?
No one will argue with that today.
Not after that little preemptive situation. Anyway.
So knowing when you really.
Yeah, when they light up. I do the same thing with the show. I didn't do anything. Unfortunately, Charlotte is not making it today because a brother that's ill in a local hospital. So she would be here. And she did a terrific job of installing. Whenever I go to an exhibit, if they install, before I get there, I start monkeying around with them. No, this should go over there. And then it sets up the next 2 hours of moving this one over that. So if it gets close, and this one is terrific installation, don't you agree, with this wonderful painting back here? You know what the title of that painting is? Why Bronze? Does that title make any sense? What makes sense? Nothing makes sense. It's all chance and circumstance. I have no idea what I'm going to do. In the process of working out a series of paintings, something happens over here and goes like that. I say, oh yeah, that's sort of interesting. But I'm pursuing this trip here. I'm going. I remember early, I was in London at the Tate, and I walked in the first room, which is the usual circus of every artist there. Bang, boom, bam, boom. And I went into the second room. These rooms were stacked up, going back maybe 7 rooms, and there's an opening leading to each room. And at the very end of the room, there's a de Kooning painting. I'm in London for the first time. I say, oh, yeah, there he is. I know that guy. So I'm going to head down to the de Kooning. Into the second room was a big room, high as this ceiling, maybe that post to here wide and this long. And down there is the opening, and there's the exit into this room going through there. It sort of goes like that. I'm aware of the presence. Paintings, great paintings, have a presence. They say, oh. They don't tell a story. There's no metaphysical delight. They're just there. Like the phenomenal world. It's just there. So I keep on moving. It does it again. I say, hey, pal, I see you, but I'm heading here. I get 3/4 through. It does it big time. I say, okay. I look up, and there's these giant Rothko paintings around the room that he'd done for the Seagrams. What was funny, before that happened, I was in New York with Sam Francis, a very celebrated painter who is now deceased. He said, how would you like to go to Rothko's studio? I said, sure. And he had a big gymnasium on the Bowery, very big. maybe 3 times as big as this whole place, with basketball hoops, but they're all pulled up. And hanging from the ceiling are these giant, there's skylights up there. Hanging from the ceiling are these parachutes. And he has these lines that he can raise and lower and control the amount of light. Like Ed Reinhardt, he liked the idea you would discover a painting. It didn't bang out. So in other words, when you're in your bedroom and you turn off the light and everything's in blackness, and little by little the chest of drawers comes up, a chair, whatever, they come into focus. So you discover the painting, you discover that they exist and they have a presence. And the presence can be, doesn't have words. These kind of paintings, or abstract paintings, are not about words, not about ideas, but responses to the phenomenal world. In other words, I'm scared to death when I go to bed at night. I'm staying at a friend's here in town, and I could not fall asleep. And then I found out afterwards they were downstairs having a great time looking at the host photographs or films. So I missed it all, and I'm laying in bed like that.
But so,
I'm not a scaredy cat. I'm a person that's terrified by the phenomenal world. Yes.
over the years, people often say that you've changed styles. So like almost as quickly as you change your shirt on a regular basis. And so that you're somewhat hard to pin down. But would you say that some of the ideas that you're working on, that you're just kind of morphing and changing, but working on some of the same ideas and just getting deeper and deeper into those?
So let's go back to the discovering of the Rothko paintings. I was going this way, and this thing goes boop, 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 like that, or louder. And that happens to me while I'm painting. I'm pursuing a series of paintings that came from the preceding series of paintings, that came from the preceding. So there's a kind of mutation, I say. One thing leads to another. The paintings mutate. Is there something in organic or biological things where things mutate? So they come out of mutations. I don't like the fact that I'm accused of changing. It's like you're changing your mind. I don't have a mind in that sense. I'm responding to the phenomenal world, and my vehicle is painting. So painting are evidence of my response, incorporated in terror, ambition, money, all the horrible things we're all caught into. Is there any way of dropping those off? Well, that's my engagement. Seeing if I can drop all that paraphernalia and be directly with the phenomenal world. Like a person meditating, he just watches his mind. He doesn't respond to the thoughts. And when he catches himself thinking, he goes back to his breathing, the most fundamental thing you do. Breath out, breath in. But you can do that 4 or 5 or 6 times, and suddenly your mind is off with another fantasy or something I should have done. I should have gone to the market. I should have had my tires changed. And as soon as you catch yourself in that situation, you go back to the breath, the most fundamental thing you do. So in painting, I try to engage in that same kind of thing. I'm just working on the paint, secret sauce. Oh, the sparkly things too. I got up in the middle of the night and I heard these little feet running right below where my paintings are all laid out. and little voices, squeaky little voices. And I look down and they're going, shh, shh. Have you ever seen a rat or a mouse in the house? And they go so fast, it's just, is that a mouse? What were these little creatures? Were they the wee people? They could be the wee people, because suddenly they disappeared. At that notion, a helicopter went flying over, and I looked up, and as I'm looking up, all these sparkly things fall from the sky and land on these paintings. And these paintings are still wet. So they accept now when I look at, these don't have them, series before, they all sparkle like that in response to what? The wee people. They made a little statement there. There was a film years ago called Chatka. I don't know if any of you remember it.
Called what?
Chatka. And it was made in South America, and it was about these magic men in this very primitive tribe. And they tried to get rain. No rain, no rain, no rain. So they went to another tribe, which was a real taboo. And this guy, the magic man in the tribe, some guys are that. Some shoot the arrows, cook the food, do it. But there's certain guys, they sleep in a separate tent. And they appear when the demand is on them to make rain, fertility, corn, whatever it is. So anyway, the guy in this tribe couldn't make. So they brought in a guy from another tribe. Whoa, this guy was really humiliated. They brought him in, and he did the jujus and all the different, rattled all the different things to bring rain. He couldn't bring rain. And while the two of them were in collision, another clue, it started raining. So if you have two opposing factors and they come together, they ignite, and there's a metamorphosis, and there's a transformation, sort of a positive term, takes place where the two things have their separate identities. And when they come together and ignite, a metamorphosis, and a third thing or another thing happens. And that's what we hope when we're making these paintings. Me. Must remember, I don't identify myself as an artist. I don't express myself. So what do? I just flop around like a fool in the phenomenal world, shaking my rattles.
Well, you've often identified yourself as more of a cave painter or an anthropologist, or...
Well, no, that's my root.
That's
my root. That's not what I am now. I'm just another fool flopping around. Every once in a while I get lucky. Boop.
Well, and in a way, even us talking about some of these ideas, there's no substitute, obviously, for really just seriously looking at the work and living with the work. But when you were talking before about the idea of having an ambition and direction, you know, early on, I think a lot of the artists in Venice working in the 50s and 60s, they always said that you guys were working, there wasn't really a, you know, there wasn't a market there yet. But I've always thought that that was kind of a myth in a way, that the competition and the dialogue between all of you guys, that was really your own, there was an ambition of a different sort. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that time and the group of artists and what that whole scene was like.
Well, sure, we were all very competitive. We were young. There were very few women around, and we all vied to get the same woman. And
the cave metaphor is coming back and back.
The primitive thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Man, woman. or vice versa. Yes, that's true. And they all became very successful. Most of them did. Billy Al Bingston, Larry Bell, who was here yesterday and lives up in Taos and has a studio in Los Angeles, did early things with glass. I don't know if you know some of his work. Robert Irwin, who is an enormous success right now. And Terrell was not involved, but he hung out. He worked as my assistant at one time when I tore out the ceiling in Rico Mizuno's gallery many years ago. As a joke, I said, with Rico, you can do anything, including tearing out the ceiling. I said, God, that's a great idea. So you can frame the sky, and the frame is blue, a blue panel up there, only interrupted by a plane or a cloud or something going by. And I thought, gee, that's a great idea. Terrell agreed to that, and he helped me do the drywall, and I made a wall within a wall so it would go up to the ceiling and frame in that possibility. First, I just took the tar paper off, peeled it back. And when I did that, the light came through and diagonal rays and printed on one wall in the morning, went out, crossed the floor, and up the other and escaped at the end of the day. And I said, Rico, this is only the first stage of this thing. We've got to take out, I'm going to lose my lease on this place. But the last 3 days, I got these carpenters to get up and cut it out. And Terrell was there, and then he made some wonderful, he was able to take off my shoulders, and sometimes that happens, better ideas than I had. Smarter guy. He has this Rodin crater out there in the Southwest somewhere. And I remember one day I was saying, God, wouldn't it be, when I was framing the sky, if you stood at the bottom of a crater and you had this circle, the sky as the circle. Well, he took that and really extended it. If you ever get a chance to see what he's done out there, it's quite amazing. He was this brilliant student at Pomona College. And
well, Rico Mizuno, who was the gallerist who actually allowed Ed to cut the ceiling out, tells some really great stories about having to face her landlord, you know, when he came in and there's a huge cut open in the ceiling, and she left that space shortly after.
Yeah, she did.
But she also told a really touching story that when people were coming into the space, and I think Sam Francis, and there's some beautiful pictures with his family, and the light was streaming in, that Ed had this rice powder, which is just so crystalline, and would throw it into the air when people walked in so that you would see the
rays of light were printed, because if light comes down, if it's not interrupted out of something to reflect out of, you won't see it other than on a wall or something like that, or a rectangle projected through a window. But these had all these in between the 1x7 boards on the ceiling. After I'd taken the roofing material off, the sun came through and projected. So we saw them printed on the wall, but I wanted to physically walk through the light and have it defined. So I got the idea of taking rice polishings. So I'd stay there all day long, and every time it was a long alley down to the gallery, and I heard people coming, I'd run and grab a handful, throw it up in the air, and all these diagonal light rays were illuminated by the rice polishings.
Very dramatic.
Yeah, it was pretty nice.
But would you say, Ed, that, you know, that time in Venice, that the idea of, that there really wasn't those like same kind of rules that were in New York at that time, that there was more a sense of innovation and you really could do whatever you want?
Well, we had an advantage here because New York was out of European influence. California is right on the edge, and then there's an ocean. In Europe, in New York, there's an ocean, and there's Europe. Here, there's Asia, a whole different ball of wax, as we know. And Asian thinking, the metaphysical thinking, the teachings that came from, Buddha came from India. He went to Tibet, went to China, Japan, and Korea. So all these countries were infiltrated by Buddha's teachings that started in India. Buddha was from India, under the tree, the Bodhi tree, the Bodhi tree.
And would you say that, some of the technologies that were being developed in Southern California, like surf culture or car culture, or even some of the things that were happening in JPL, the idea for the resin work, did that come from?
Well, my resin paintings were responses to everybody was using resin as a transparent physical form. And I didn't like that. And I thought, what can I do? And I knew that when I took canvases off the stretcher bars, they were so beautiful. The extension, the painting stopping 4 or 5 inches from the edge, and the remnants of the paint. And it did a beautiful thing. And I thought, how can I put those like a driver's license, encase them in plastic? And Dwayne Valentine, of all people, I asked him because he did a lot of things with resins at that time. And pouring them, Irwin did these long, tall towers later, and Peter Alexander did things. A lot of the artists did things. So it was we were very privy to the technology and JPL and all these different things. In New York, they were somewhere else. They weren't into the resins and the plastics and things. Later on, they did get influenced by us, of all things. But Bankston was one of the early guys. He used industrial paints sprayed on like a motorcycle tank, only he put them on these big masonite panels with circles, and they were extraordinary. Everybody went crazy for them here. And Walter Hopps was trying to encourage a group develop some collectors. There were no collectors in Los Angeles at that time. This was 56 to 58. And Walter talked UCLA in giving him a teaching gig at night, and all of the rich and powerful people took his class, word of mouth, that this guy was brilliant. Come and take. And he introduced the abstract expressionists and de Kooning and the Europeans, and then us. He wanted to give us a base that we didn't come from nowhere. We came from these great painters, but we're here now. And Bankston did these motorcycle paints, and Craig Kaufman did these transparencies on plexiglass and made forms and shapes. The shapes came from Frederick's ads. Frederick's was a place that made these lingerie for women, very provocative lingerie. And Craig loved the catalogs. So he abstracted some of the shapes and made these vacuum-formed panels. And then the best things he ever did, he took these plexiglass that were about 5 by 8 feet long and fogged them in different colors so they would taper with a spray gun. And then he draped them over a clothesline, and they hung in the galleries in these different places. They were really magnificent. So all these guys were doing these fantastic things. And there I was doing these little rose drawings that I got from a oilcloth in Tijuana that had these flowers. And I thought, I want to make something and fill it in. And I like the idea of density. I figured if I pressed hard enough and long enough, something would come out. No one liked them. I showed
Now
them.
it's ironic because those are some of your,
Yeah, now they're worth a lot of money. And I'm having a big drawing retrospective at LACMA in 2 years. Those drawings and then some other drawings would be the footnote to that, of panels just of graphite patterning, dense, dense, press, press, dense, dense. And I got the idea when you have your teeth filled with silver and they press and you could hear that squeaking through that little place. And I thought, well, I'm going to do that all over, all over. They went over like a turd in a punch bowl. No one was interested in them. Now they are, time marches on. And here we are with this.
but it's interesting with the resin paintings, so much of those had to do with kind of the residual image that was left underneath.
That's true.
And now some of your more recent work and then other works that you're doing currently that aren't on display here are kind of pushing that idea even more. You know, the ones where you're seeing on the natural canvas that are up at Leslie Sachs right now. So it's that same idea, but just using different materials and really still kind of
Well, what I
push
did
through.
was the reversals of canvases. I did the positive canvas, which were the grid. Charlotte has a couple in that back room of the grid paintings. And I noticed when I took them off, when they were stretched over a panel, a ghost image was left there, just barely the impression of these diagonals, but intermittently. And I thought, how in the world am I going to get those to print more? So I wet them down. When they were wet, they just came out. So I found some resins that I could coat the whole surface. And when it was wet, it pulled the image out on the surface. So I had the other side of the mirror. And mirrors have always intrigued me a lot. There was an early film of Cocteau. It was called Orphée. And the hero in this very metaphysical approach to the world, in other words, there's secrets, but the secrets are on the other side. How do you get to the other side? Well, the other side of the mirror. So he put on these rubber gloves, walked up to this mirror, and dissolved inside. Unfortunately, Cocteau showed you what was really corny with lamps and surrealist activity going down this long hall. What's wonderful, we don't know what's on the other side of the mirror. It's like years ago I met, who's that physicist?
Hawking?
Hawkins, in a
Stephen
hallway at Caltech. And
Stephen
I had,
Hawking?
yeah, Stephen Hawkins. And I had this idea that I'd heard about the gravity in black holes. They're not quite sure what they are. Now they describe these uninfracted blank situations as black holes, maybe. But anyway, the thought then was this gravity would all pull to this little thing with billions and billions of densities in there, and when they got so tight, they would explode out. And that's where the Big Bang theory. Then they discovered there was more than one Big Bang. That the universe is made up of them simultaneously going off all the time. That's one of the thoughts. So I thought, gee, what about, instead of it blows out, what if it turns inside out? And what phenomenal situation will be inside out? Well, we don't know. will all this Einstein, all this kind of stuff be reacted to? In other words, be inside out, be on the other side? So I was in the hall with him, and I told him my thought. Can you imagine the audacity? This goddamn fool. Anyway, he looked at me for a long time, and then he wrote on the face of his computer, because he could do it just doing funny moves, finally. And he said a wormhole. Now, you know what a wormhole is. I'd never heard of a wormhole. And the description of a wormhole is really sort of obtuse. And I remember early on, physicist I met, he said, imagine a piece of ribbon candy and space going inside out like that. But what about the edge? Where's the center wall? It's hard to comprehend infinite, is it not? No end? Does that mean no beginning? Well, they suggest there was a beginning. I don't know. Anyway, all these paintings that I do are loaded with that kind of information, but coming through in some subliminal way, maybe.
I mean, the idea of a wormhole, I think just looking at these paintings, it really makes a compelling case, and one could understand that idea. And I also think that, you know, when you look at your various works over the past several decades, that there's not that many changes and shifts. It's just kind of a morphing and a kind of extending out from one thing to the next. So I think that there's a lot of, there's a PhD dissertation out there for any graduate student.
That's right.
But maybe we can spend a few minutes taking questions. We actually said we have a new slogan. We're not taking questions. We're not reacting. We're taking responses. So if you have a question or a response, if you want to just raise your hand and speak loud enough so that everybody can hear.
And don't be embarrassed.
There's no such thing as a dumb question.
Yeah, that's right. I know.
Although there is sometimes, but not today.
Ed, when you talk about that magic, or that feeling that you get when you see a certain painting, when you know that that's a good one, and I know exactly what you're talking about, but can you take it to another step and you look back later and figure out why?
There's no answer to the why. There's no whys, except up here. There's a why there. Why bronze is the title of that painting. Anyway, no, I don't really have not only an answer, I don't have a response to that, because I don't think when you look at a painting, people are always trying to get a meaning out of it. What does it mean? Who's the philosopher? What's her name from New York?
Susan Sontag?
Susan Sontag. She wrote a book against interpretation. And if you get involved with trying to make meaning or interpretation, unless they have certain Rorschach possibilities, and I like to play with that. Is there an image? Is there a face in there? Or is that just my projection? And we spend a lot of time projecting our animations, our imaginations to everything. So we're missing out on what's really going on. Well, what's really going on? Does it have words? Does it have meanings? Or is it about some kind of experience? The evidence that something is happening there and it's sort of vibrating, but it doesn't have words. It doesn't have meaning.
Oftentimes, you know, a viewer or a spectator kind of wants to find something there in order to ground it in a way, but that's not always the best way to look at work. But Ed, there are some things, let's say, that you thought were a dud, and then 5 years later or 10 years later, you look back and you're like,
yes, I've
damn,
had
that was
kind of-
good.
Yeah, I was surprised, because often I must destroy 100 paintings a year. And people say, well, why don't you give them to me? And I said, there's enough pollution going on, so why do I want to spread it out? So if it doesn't really pass the test. Now, sometimes I do keep paintings because they have clues and suggestions, but are not complete in their existence. They have rough edges. And I used to want to go back and fix those paintings up. Yes, and I used to step back. Then I got smart and I hung a canvas 2 feet back from the paintings when I was walking out, so I could never get back and make a correction based on my taste and my experience, because then I'm just going to project that and I'm not going to discover anything. I want to find things out. I don't want to make statements about what I know. How boring is that? Does that answer?
That does. Do we have another question?
Don't be chicken.
Don't.
You.
You want me to answer your question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I just had this picture of our last encounter, which was so funny. Anyway,
Do tell. Okay.
you know, Southern View, there's Terrell, like I said, was kind of out of it.
Right.
Irwin was around, Ellie Allen was around,
Craig Kaufman.
Craig Coffin and Peter Alexander. So, and we also with Ed Richet
Yeah.
and
He came later on.
Price.
Yeah. And then Lynn Folks, and he was drummed out. Bingston and Irwin drummed him out of the corps, like they did with Diebenkorn. Walter was going to bring Diebenkorn in, and they blackballed him. Can you believe? And I was almost in a fight with those guys. I said, Diebenkorn? Well, he copped out was the term at that time, because he was an abstract painter. Then he did figurative paintings with his wife, Phyllis, was in a lot of the paintings. And he became figurative. Well, that was taboo at that time at the gallery, until Ed Richet came on board. And I remember Bingston made these belts for everybody that was in the gallery, and he put Foreman, whatever the name he gave them. I think I was Foreman. And Ed Richet was Waterboy. Well, he got the last laugh. Yeah. Because he's numero uno now. He's a great painter, and he comes outside. There's only one guy that steps out from that, and that's Chris Burden, who steps out of the whole milieu of the artist and being an artist. His imagination extends. I remember thinking about the Citadel Wall. He did a piece with Bob Wilhite. It was an old garage, and he painted the interior of the garage black. So 2 of us, when I was in with Grinstein, I forgot, there were 4 chairs. You came through these curtains. So when you went into this room, they would lead you to sit down, some assistant of Chris's. And then after you were seated, suddenly matched lights and a candle. And then he turns on this recording, this scratchy recording of his voice talking about going into outer space. And hanging from threads from the ceiling are these squadrons of outer space rockets and vehicles. It was just the most amazing thing. Didn't fit into anybody's game at all. And then He follows the candle around, identifying these various squadrons, having to be careful with the recording on the floor while he walks around from one to the other. And then finally he gets to the back wall, and he calls that the citadel wall. Do you remember in 2001, there was a citadel wall there? Because we cannot comprehend no end. We want to put a wall, we want to put a definition. You know, these early guys that were afraid of falling off the earth when they thought the world was flat, and if they got to the edge, I've been there all of my life. What's that?
Bruce Nauman.
Oh, yeah, well, he's an amazing artist, too. No, he was never part of that. Irwin and he hung out a little bit. And I remember when he hit it rich, he went out and bought himself a big, not a big, a Ferrari sports car, and drove it up to Irwin's place, and we were all out there admiring it. He's done some great pieces, so those neon pieces with guys with erections popping up and down and heads upside down and long corridors.
I was telling a few people yesterday that there's a documentary film called The Cool School, and it tells the story about the Ferris Gallery and that development of the scene. So if you're interested in finding out more, it's worth Netflixing it. Netflixing. Yeah. Netflixing. Another question, the last question, should we just wrap it up?
Hasn't this been fun? I just have the best time doing this.
Okay.